Okay, everyone, we have most of you here, so as it's 6:04, we're going to get started with a roll call. This is a joint PZB HRPB workshop for some training, especially for our new members.
Elaine DeRisso, Laura Devlin, Bob Dorenzo, Ken Gross, Michelle Huffman, Ed DeVoe, Ed LeBlanc. Okay. Mark Hum, Daniela Amador, Daryl Shadow,
Here.
Dan Waleski,
Here.
Greg Richter,
Here.
Dave Matthews,
Here.
Henry Polsky.
Here.
You got it.
And we are live streaming. Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Ann Hamilton. I'm presenting the HRPB portion of this. This mainly applies to our HRPB board members, but some aspects of it do apply to PZB, so please make sure you all are paying attention. So to start out with, you all are part of an advisory and quasi-judicial board. It has a dual role, both PZB and HRPB. These advisory boards are created by ordinance, resolution, Florida statute, or motion approved by the City Commission, and you all are here to provide advice and recommendations to the City Commissions on matters of public concern. This is your advisory capacity. You are all appointed by the Commission and serve at their pleasure, and then you also serve a dual role as quasi-judicial board members, such as the Planning and Zoning Board and HRPB, and you perform functions similar to courts. So essentially, your decisions on quasi-judicial matters are binding. So you all should know what particular role you serve. Some of you are citizens of the community, volunteers. You're all appointed by the commission. Some of you have professional qualifications. Some of you are citizens at large. And this is just a brief overview of what you're here to do. So for our HRPB board members, you kind of have two dual roles. So the HRPB serves as both the Historic Preservation Review Board for the city and also reviews zoning applications and essentially carries out the functions of PZB for all properties located within historic districts. Now we'll go over that in more detail when we get to the PZB section of the presentation. I'll do a quick overview in a minute, but more specifically for the historic preservation portion, as some of you know, you review requests for certificates of appropriateness. So usually those are for exterior alterations, new construction, additions, demolitions, essentially any major changes that are going on to a property located within a historic district that rises above staff level of review. You also are tasked with reviewing historic waivers. So as we'll go into in a little bit, the historic board does have special powers granted to it in order to waive certain requirements of the Florida Building Code and zoning and land development regulations for historic buildings and for FEMA flood exemption. And then as an advisory board, you advise to the City Commission on matters of ad valorem tax exemption and designation of historic properties. So those are the two items for HRPB that ultimately you are an advisory board on. You do make a recommendation to the City Commission, but those items ultimately would go on to them and it would be their decision. So for planning applications, as we'll discuss later, both boards serve as an advisory board for plan development, sustainable bonus incentives, transfer of development rights incentives, rezonings, comprehensive plan amendments, and right-of-way abandonments. Those are all recommendations that go to the City Commission. And you serve as the final decision on variances from the land development regulations, development of significant impacts, major site plans, conditional use permits, and general reviews for consistency with the city's comp plan and LDR. So for historic preservation, Just a quick overview. Why do we preserve? Historic districts are intended to preserve a sense of place. So we're usually looking to preserve scale, context, massing, architectural style, and really looking to ensure appropriate alterations, additions, and infill development in historic districts. So ultimately, we're trying to preserve architecture, but that is, in a sense, creating a memory and preserving people's memory of a sense of place. Um, but some things that people don't often consider is sustainability. So historic preservation is inherently sustainable. Uh, Historic buildings are usually designed for the local climate. The most sustainable building is usually the one that already exists because of the amount of embodied carbon in a building. So, we're also tasked with a sustainability role in making sure that, resources and valuable structures in the city are preserved rather than demolished and replaced. Uh, Preservation also generates a lot of economic value in terms of property values. Usually, property values are higher in historic districts. Um, Local job creation, if you're working on a historic structure, usually that goes to local contractors rather than someone out of the area. So revenue is coming in, and tax generation, because property values are usually higher. Usually tax bases are higher in historic districts. So just as a brief overview, historic preservation is considered similar to zoning, a legitimate local exercise of police power, and it's often regulated through the same department as planning and zoning in most municipalities, like the city of Lake Worth Beach. And that's why essentially the Historic Preservation Board has a dual role and serves both of those functions. Um, this is a valid use of property regulation, and it's handed down by essentially the powers that are not designated to the federal government or the state government are handed to the local government, and that's where the power to regulate historic preservation comes in. So how do we do this in practice? That's our historic preservation ordinance. That is section 23.5-4 of the land development regulations. These are based on the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation and historic preservation. And it outlines the responsibilities of the board, the preservation goals, and the specific review criteria. So when you guys are reviewing applications, the exact criteria that you need to review an application on is based in that ordinance. And then our design guidelines, which is a document that we use that's very valuable to show us the different appropriate alterations, new construction options for historic districts. These are incorporated by reference through the LDR, so they are also a legally binding document. So some supplementary documents, like I mentioned, we have the design guidelines. We have major thoroughfare design guidelines. Those apply to some areas of historic districts, not all. They're a zoning regulation, but some specific areas do have some overlap. So that's something that essentially just guides compatible development within major core areas of thoroughfares. And then we also have survey reports of historic districts, which show us the exact resources that are located there. That's something that we have records of for all of our historic districts. And we also have educational guidelines for homeowners that can kind of explain to them some of the important principles of historic preservation. So, how does a historic designation come about? So, our historic districts were largely created in the 1990s and early 2000s. And then a more recent resurvey was done in 2015 to 2020, but was not adopted. So, what is currently adopted by ordinance is most of those original surveys from the 90s to 2000s. So districts are generally created with neighborhood participation and input from property owners. This is the same process that we followed in the 90s, we'd follow today. We currently have 6 districts. The general criteria, not to go into too much detail, but usually to establish a district, you need 40% of the structures in the particular identified area to be 50 years old or older, and one other review criteria that we'll go over in a bit. And then for a district, no more than 50% of the owners of a landmark property can object to the designation. So what are contributing and non-contributing properties? Because those are some terms that we use fairly often. Contributing properties are those properties 50 years old or older at the time of the survey, and they're usually considered to have a identifying significant feature. And generally, for our historic districts, they exhibit a typology of architecture that is connected to the period of significance for that district. Now, a non-contributing structure, which has a lower level of review, is usually outside of that period of significance, so usually younger than 50 years old at the time of survey, or if it's much older, it would have been probably altered or had incompatible changes over the years that could not be reversed, or perhaps the surveyor wasn't able to determine, what key features would make it contributing, and so it ultimately became non-contributing. That's usually the differentiation. And what about those buildings outside of historic districts? There are plenty that could be evaluated for historic designation, but without historic designation, they don't fall under the protections of historic preservation. Property owners can always elect individually to designate or come together as a neighborhood to elect to become a district. Within a historic district, if you were identified also as potentially becoming contributing in the survey that we did recently, those property owners can also become contributing if they elect to. However, I should note there is not really a mechanism for a property owner to elect to become non-contributing. That requires a full resurvey of a district. And that would need to be undertaken under the same process as establishing a district, and it requires a heavy burden of evidence, essentially, that the reasoning for creating the district would no longer apply and those structures would become non-contributing. So that's something that occasionally comes up. It's not something that really there is a mechanism for it, but it would be very difficult. So if anyone asks you, those are the reasons that something is or isn't a historic district. Now, so like I mentioned, usually when we establish a historic district, there's two criteria that generally get used. Now, there's other ones. It can be significant in, say, archaeology, but unfortunately, we don't have any sites in the city that are designated under that. Um, Generally, we're looking for districts that possess an integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So again, that's kind of the idea of a sense of place that I was talking about before, where you can walk into a neighborhood and say, this is a historic neighborhood. I, can see a particular rhythm and scale on the streetscape. And then usually you need to have, again, 40% of structures being 50 years old or older, and then usually they embody a particular type of architecture of a type, period, or method of construction. Usually the different structures within Lake Worth wouldn't merit designation a lot of the time on their own, but as a collection of structures, they merit designation as a district because they embody a collection of a typology and a sense of change over time. So, just a general overview. You all are called the Historic Resources Preservation Board, but there's actually an important distinction to be made between what actually is preservation. There are usually 4 different umbrella treatments under the historic preservation broad context. Preservation would be something like, essentially stabilizing an existing building, leaving the property exactly how it is and freezing it in time. So, for example, the example up in the left corner that's called Drayton Hall in South Carolina, that building has been preserved exactly as it was. It doesn't have air conditioning. There has been no interior renovations. It's an 18th century plantation, and it, since the 1970s, has been exactly the same as it was. Now, reconstruction is something like up on the upper right hand, Colonial Williamsburg. So Colonial Williamsburg in the 1920s was reconstructed based on architectural evidence. So structures when you go to Colonial Williamsburg are not original historic structures. That's considered reconstruction. And a third item would be restoration. So bringing a property back to a particular time period. This particular example was James Madison's house. And as you can see here, when they chose to restore it, they chose to take off later alterations and additions and take it back to its period of significance when it was first constructed. Now, these items are just kind of an overview for you to show what, quite frankly, we're not really most of the time doing here, if at all. What you all are tasked with doing is rehabilitation. This is the most common historic preservation toolkit that is used. This is the only one that allows alterations, construction of new additions, and allows for the continuing or new use for a historic building. So as you can see here, this is an example of Chicago, because I'm biased. I'm from there. This is the Carson Peary Scott department store that was originally constructed, and in the last 10 years, it's been rehabilitated into a Target. So that's adaptive reuse. They made alterations to the structure, but still kept its original form. You can still see its character-defining features, but today it's a Target retailer rather than its original use as a department store. So essentially, the goal of rehabilitation is making possible compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving the important character-defining features. Sometimes people call this adaptive reuse. That's another term that you hear sometimes. So our design guidelines are based on the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. This is a wall of text, I know, but they're important to review just so you know kind of what our design guidelines are ultimately foundationally based on. Usually we're looking at a couple of the particular standards I would call out would be 6. So usually the goal is to repair rather than replace deteriorated historic features. When replacing them, we want to match the new with the old in design, color, texture, and materials if possible. And then 9 and 10 also usually come in, especially when we're doing additions and infill construction. So the goal would be for new additions, exterior alterations, or new construction to not destroy historic materials, features, and spatial relationships that characterize the property, while differentiating the new from the old, but still being compatible with materials, features, scale, size, proportion, and massing. And along similar lines for 10, new additions and new construction should always be undertaken in such a way that the essential form and integrity of the historic property would be unimpaired, and it could ultimately be removed in the future if necessary. So some important Lake Worth documents. We have our COA approval matrix. So this essentially outlines what goes to you as the board and what we can review as staff. This is something that I'll send to you all tomorrow morning as a document. And then for your reference, also our standard certificate of appropriateness application that all applicants need to submit with their requests. So just to go over quickly, what you're usually looking at is our design review qualitative standards. So those, again, come from the design guidelines based on the Secretary of the Interior standards. And we have kind of a set of standards that we do and don't want you to do. And those are very nicely depicted in the design guidelines pictorially a lot of the time. So we're usually looking for visual compatibility, making sure that we're following what's outlined in the staff reports, or if disagreeing with that, giving a reasoning for why that is. Looking at the significant character-defining features, the significance of the structure itself, and how it fits into the surrounding district in scale, massing, design, character, and usually falling under rehabilitation for the treatment options. So what you're not looking to do is creating arbitrary standards. Well, I just don't like this design, making decisions on what's pretty. Unfortunately, sometimes some of the things that we want to preserve or rehabilitate, the options are not always going to be the prettiest option. It's going to be the most historically appropriate. Not every historic building is pretty, but we're not looking for beauty awards. We're looking for essentially the truest representation of what would have originally been there. Preservation is never going to be one size fits all. Just because you make a decision on one property doesn't mean you necessarily always have to make that decision on another. You just have to have a reasoning why there's a difference between them. So yes, your decisions are important, but just because, you say, oh, well, we need this type of door, we need this design on this property, doesn't mean that the next month you're prevented from coming up with a reason that, no, that doesn't actually apply in this case. So a couple of the incentives that you have as a historic board that PZB can't offer, so you all are more special. we have an ad valorem tax exemption program. We've discussed this a little bit at recent board meetings. So this allows the HRPB to recommend to the city commission for a particular property, only contributing properties, to exempt the improvement value for a period of 10 years for the restoration, renovation, or rehabilitation of historic properties. So this is 100% of the improvement value that would be taxable under the county on your ad valorem portion of the taxes. I have an example here that we can go through. Um, so if you can see, this is actually a property that in 2023 finished a rehabilitation, and they didn't get their post-construction documents in time, so their taxes went up from 9,000 to 23,000 when they made that large improvement. Now they did get their ad valorem taxes exemption forms in after that, and so for the year of 2025, their property taxes went down for the ad valorem portion back to that 9,538 because they have that freeze for a period of 10 years. So this is actually a good pictorial representation of what you are doing when you approve something like this. You are essentially freezing it at its previous value for that property owner for that period of 10 years. So the way that application works is the property owner needs to request it at the original hearing. So come to you and say, these particular improvements meet the criteria for ad valorem construction. You all would agree with that. They would make the improvements and then come back to you and say, okay, here are the improvements. This is called the post-construction portion of the application. They come back to you, they say, here are the improvements, and hopefully you all look at them and say, great job, you did exactly what we wanted. We're going to recommend to the city commission that they adopt a resolution that this particular property made the improvements that they said they were going to, and therefore are eligible for this tax exemption. Those documents then go as a package to Palm Beach County, and they review and approve, and then actually do the hard work of calculating the taxes, which I certainly don't know how to do. So another incentive that you all are able to offer for historic properties only, only landmarks and contributing structures, are historic waivers. So these are intended to encourage improvements and reuse of existing buildings. And so you can, if the applicant requests, waive or modify certain land development regulations, such as setbacks, lot width, area, height, open space, parking, circulation, design compatibility requirements, and other similar regulations. The only things that you can't approve them for are those that are shown at the end there. So permitted land uses, you can't waive something that's not a permitted land use. Can't give someone additional density because, as we'll go into later, that is based on the comprehensive plan and you can't just create density for people, or environmental and health standards. And the final incentive that you have is variances. So this usually comes into variances from the Florida Building Code. Contributing structures are able to exempt themselves from the requirement of bringing the structure up to Florida Building Code, assuming that the proposed repair, improvement, rehabilitation will not preclude the building's continued designation as a historic building, and the variance is the minimum necessary. So usually this comes into play with your FEMA flood exemption variances. So the only way under FEMA's flood code that you can get a variance is if you are a historic building. And that is because it is very important and very sometimes difficult to raise a historic structure and still keep its contributing and character defining features. So one of the links I'm going to send to you, and I encourage you all to read, is the National Park Service guidelines on adaptive flood treatment. That's something that, you know, if you're concerned about giving people flood variances, that's kind of the alternate route, is design options. But those variances are intended really to preserve the historic character of the building, both from Florida Building Code requirements and from FEMA. And that ends the historic portion of our presentation. Do you have any questions, Bill? So I think ultimately that is a city commission decision that needs to be addressed that is on them to adopt. So it's not really an issue on the historic board's end.
Because it wasn't adopted, city staff, when they're reviewing applications, they do check to see, you'll see it sometimes when an application comes forward. This property is not a contributing structure in the new survey. It would have been, but that wasn't adopted. So you can take that into consideration, but it's not part of the full analysis because the commission did not adopt that updated study.
So that was conducted between 2015 and 2020. And just one other point, like I said, so if you were in that survey, a non-contributing property that would have converted to a contributing property, that is something that property owners can electively choose to designate themselves as at a staff level as well.
Okay, now, if they haven't done it now, I don't think they're gonna do it soon, approve that, adopt that survey. But can they still adopt that survey as is, being that it's between 5 and 10 years old? Or does a new one have to be done if they were planning on updating it?
So they could adopt it. As far as doing a new survey, it's not something a lot of the time for historic programs that is done super frequently. So I would say, a 5-10 year old survey is not that out of the realm of normality. Every 20 years, ideally, yes, historic programs should be resurveying, every year if possible. But no one has the manpower to do that. So, really a 5-10 year old survey is not terribly out of date, especially not to get into too much, technical consideration, but especially since we're now getting into, 50 years old or older is getting into the 1970s, and that's not necessarily a period of significance for a lot of our districts. So it's not something where I would really think that we would be, expecting a ton of structures that would be architecturally significant to be coming of age, for lack of a better term, in the interim. Some of our districts, yes, I would say extend up into the 60s. That's kind of your, mid-century, but usually the 60s is kind of the cutoff for any of the latest periods of significance. I mean, I will say we reference it. We reference it every day. So yes, I will say it's unfortunate that it was never adopted because it's an incredibly, comprehensive and really well researched piece of research. But it's actually a really valuable reference for us as staff. So if there's a sliver of a bright side, we reference that all the time, just as far as, age, architectural style. It really is a great document. It's just, it was never adopted. So we can't consider it to be, legally binding, for lack of a better term.
You mentioned Secretary Standards. Now that's Florida states, that states with the Florida statute.
So, strictly speaking, Florida's certified local government program and regulatory guidelines for historic buildings would actually be based on the Secretary of the Interior standards. So the Secretary of the Interior standards are a federal level. They're from the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service, which regulates, in short, historic programs from the top down. So it's usually a, National Park Service, Secretary of the Interior, SHPO, so State Historic Preservation Office, that would be Florida. And then below that, that would be us as a local government. Yes.
Yeah. One other thing. Well, I guess, yeah, that's the power to be. That's it. Let's get that question. Thank you.
So when you said you really put there and check it all, like, to be a historic district, you have to have 40% over 50 years old, and certain percentage of people that live there, they say, yeah, we don't do that. Can you tell me, like, for instance, say like in College Park, why is east of Federal not historic and west of Federal because it's the interesting?
So I guess I can't address the specifics of that because I wasn't around for it, but I will say a lot of the time when you do see historic districts organized that way, it usually does denote that there was a lack of support in a particular area or a lack of. So whatever would be considered, say they had been looking to designate, College Park as a rectangle of like 10 blocks. Well, when they did the survey of that, either that eastern, 5 blocks didn't have the significance they were looking for. Say there were just too many structures that had been removed or altered or were too new, or something where, okay, we have broad support on the west side of the district. Property owners over here love it. Property owners on the east side, all of them really don't want to be in a historic district. A lot of the time, that's sometimes where boundaries for historic districts come from. So it's a little bit of a mix of, okay, we're looking at, what we need to be preserving. And then also, when you establish a historic district, there's a lot of public input. And, if people are, say we get more than 50% of property owners that say, I don't want to be part of this district, then, okay, that's not part of the district. Yes, it's usually every property owner has to send in essentially a signed ballot that says, I would like to or not like to be involved.
If you didn't vote or didn't know, you were considered a yes.
So that is the way the ordinance is written. If 50% of property owners object, then that kills it. So under the ordinance, yes, that is a correct way to do it. I think maybe if we were establishing a district now, we would want more affirmative assent from property owners. As far as, no, I do want to be part of this. This is just based on my experience in other municipalities establishing a historic district. It's, a little bit more coverage as far as the city if we're going to establish something now. But yes, when South Palm Park was established, that is what the ordinance says. You can you can set it up where you can send it a ballot that says, no, I don't want to be part of this, and you don't have to respond otherwise. So that is the process, and they did follow it correctly.
So you could, send us information for FEMA? Your document?
Yeah, so I have a guide with some links. The Department of the Interior has prepared a very comprehensive guidelines book, similar to our design guidelines, that essentially show you what are some good flood adaptation strategies. So that's something that I would encourage all of you to review. Just as flood zone related questions come up, it seems like every single board meeting. So, if you have more information in your toolkit, I would encourage you to read it. So yes, I'll send links to that.
It's packaged. We never do have, they're going roof elevations, they're going other information, but finished floor elevation, that is not there. So, right now. That's a new build, yeah. But
They weren't asking for the variance.
The thing about it, we should read the number finished floor elevation. My point being is, with all the new construction that might happen along the Palmway corners and the lakeside corners, the city should know. FEMA sets the elevation, but it could be 40 feet high. That means it's almost a recommendation. They don't have to hit that 40 feet. They can go 4 feet above the trend of the river and still be at the cliff. Do you have any kind of guidelines for our boards can regulate what can happen that don't impact property next door. Like we have a property right now, Lakeside, on Lakeside, that we have guys 6, 7, 8 feet high. Now, Randy, that guy, he didn't get the plan, that owner didn't have those plans approved. The previous owner had the plans approved. What should have happened was, that should have came back to what the board, somehow it didn't come in, what was. And the changes were made, I guess, that, and the department of, I guess you guys took over, whatever happened. That was a, that was a oversight. Because what's going on there now? I've been in construction for 40 years, I've seen the same thing.
So I can't address that particular application because I wasn't involved in the review of it. I will say the one last month, just for clarification, they did provide their finished floor elevation. They did show it was just a notation error. So they did provide evidence that they are meeting FEMA guidelines. They just needed to notate it correctly. And we've met since then, and they are addressing all of those comments. However, as far as strategies for, yes, I do think that I agree. The amount of height and fill that FEMA requires, the and this is something that those guidelines do address. And again, I would encourage you to read them. It does sometimes affect neighboring properties because of runoff. We don't really have, especially for new construction, the ability to regulate that essentially, because for no, you can only do a waiver for a contributing building. So like last week that you're referencing, that was a new construction project. So they're not eligible for any waivers. They do have to meet current flood elevation requirements. Now, obviously, they need to do that in the most sensitive way possible. The city will require, as part of site plan review, that they are not having significant amounts of runoff. From a historic perspective, we really don't want them to have an overall height that especially like towers over their neighbors or something. That's, something that I think we need to be reviewing more carefully, just in the context of the streetscape. But as far as new construction, they are not eligible for a waiver. So they do have to meet that base flood elevation plus the 1-foot freeboard. And we do not have any opportunity to exempt that.
What you're saying is bringing in a lot of fill, and then the building from a streetscape standpoint does not necessarily look as high versus putting it on stilts or on a high foundation where the building may appear higher, but in reality is the exact same height, but does not have the impact of, in addition to flooding out their neighbor, also changing the entire historical character of the ground. I mean, coming in and building up 5 feet of dirt seems less historically compatible than building a taller building because of modern flood issues. Is that something that the city could look at of saying we don't want these huge fill? Because FEMA doesn't require how much fill is brought in. They have no requirements whatsoever for that. In fact, FEMA would prefer you build up on stilts and water flows underneath it, as they do in the Keys.
Yeah.
As we probably will do here one day. So filling in lots that block the natural flow of water, especially when there is no geological survey that I'm aware of, that shows the water flow through Lake Worth historically. And we do have properties where water flows through the alley to a neighboring property. We have other ones where it flows sideways. We have all this water flow that is unmapped. And then we're building huge walls. It is, it definitely seems like that should be frowned upon, and that there should be room within the historic board to push towards elevating the structure conventionally, putting a porch on it, putting stairs, as opposed to raising up an entire quarter acre of land.
And I think that comes into play more with new construction. Usually with existing historic buildings, people a lot of the time do want to keep it at their current elevation. So we don't see issues with that as much with existing buildings. But yes, I do think, and not to keep pushing the flood guidelines, but I do think that's something as a board, we should probably, be considering carefully. I think there's there's differences. Obviously, building up a house on stilts is also not really in the context of the architectural style of Lake Worth. So, there's a concern about, you know, yeah. So yeah, not necessarily on stilts, but yes, a raised crawl space with, breakaway walls. I think that's something that a lot of property owners should be considering. And then also,
The ability if someone comes in and says, "Well, I want to fill my whole lot and do slab on grade and build retaining walls," do they have the ability to say, "Well, that's not historically appropriate"?
I'm
Seems like
gonna
they-
defer to you on that one.
Seems like they would definitely.
We can look into that.
And one of the significant disturbing things.
Ed and I live across the street from one that's really built up. I believe that the bottom of the front door, because it's gonna be facing the side, is even with the roof line of the house next door. And the same thing's gonna happen on the south side. So you have these two monster homes built up, and then you have these low-lying mid-century modern homes that have a low roof on them, and we're right at the bottom of the front door, at the top of the roof. So it's pretty.
So one recommendation I have for you as a board, and I think this is something that we can also work on as staff, is the streetscapes. So that's really where you are going to see your context in terms of, okay, this is what this house is going to look like in scale with its neighbor. And I think that it's something where we can probably push applicants. Streetscapes, quite frankly, are one of the items that people have a little bit more of trouble with, especially architects that aren't used to dealing in historic districts. They're not familiar with it as a requirement. So a lot of the time they don't perhaps have the level of detail that they could. But if the board wished to go in that direction, say when an application comes in, and if you all found that, obviously as staff, we would be looking at it and tell them if we don't think that it's adequate. But if you as the board think, okay, this is not a representation that tells us what the scale of this building will be in context of its surroundings, especially given the context of flood elevation, that's something that you can, ask an applicant to come back with. Say, no, we want to continue this item because we really don't have the context that we want for the scale in terms of its surrounding area. And not only just looking at the streetscape, but also just looking at the overall height of the building. If someone, is coming in with an application, they're saying, well, I want to max out at, the 30 feet that I'm allowed to code, I think it's important for us to consider, as staff, as a board, what that's going to look like in context with that fill. So yes, people are allowed to ask for the maximum under zoning code, but you, as a board, certainly are also allowed to ask them to lower that. Take the necessary steps to say, no, this is not in context because we know that you're going to need to elevate this structure significantly because of FEMA. You all are empowered to ask that. That's how we get good designs. That's, we as staff can try and push that, and you as a board can try and push that. So if that's something that's a direction that you all would like to see properties and property owners go in, I would say that is certainly within your scope and your bounds to request from people.
What did I think? There's a lot of things. The alley is not utilized more. And then another thing, the beautification of the alley. Staff are looking on that. What's that issue?
So yes, I do have an answer for you on that we were discussing last week. I keep trying to say last month. It was a week ago. For single family and single family, two family developments, and possibly also three. I will have to double check that. I'm sorry. They are exempted from the requirement of improving the alley. So the application that we saw that was adding an ADU, they do not have to improve the alley to add parking off the alley.
But however, we have some quadruplexes that we push through. Doesn't have asphalt, they have dirt. So where do the bucks stop? Okay, the single family homes don't have to improve the alley. Quads and the mixed use they have to improve their product for Fortune Valley.
I believe that's how the regulations are written, yes.
Have some piece of alley done, piece of alley not done. See where we go? So what's happening is going forward, you should make where that's really, I call everybody newcomers because where how long I've been here. They used to utilize those alleys for their parking. I used to work for people. I used to work for public work. I've walked every one of these alleys probably 1,000 times. No, probably 10 times. Because I used to walk behind a crane. Right, that it's not for me. So what happened was when the snowbirds came down, you never knew they was here because they parked in the alley. Now, you know, we can barely, you go down some of these sites, you can barely get through the alley. You can barely get down and get through the alley, because you have on-street parking. So eventually, that's the issue that needs to be addressed, our parking and utilizing the alleys that were designed first.
I think we're getting a little off topic.
Well, no, I'm.
We have a whole nother.
I know.
So yes, we might get into that in the planning portion of the presentation. Ultimately, that would require a code change. And just to be clear, no one.
We have a whole nother
I know
presentation,
that.
so I'd like to hear the other presentation, and then some of these things may come up as well.
Let me hear this, let me just say this to staff. I think we should have had two separate board meetings so that we could properly answer all the questions, because I have to leave to another meeting and it's already I have to leave at 7. So nothing unfair about asking questions is to be able to ask all the questions you want, but I think we should have had a home.
If I'm gonna come to a workshop, I want my question answered, so when I'm gonna send up to the top there, I know where I'm going. Well, so.
Okay, let's see if the parking is addressed in the PZB section, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I've got a question about parking. So not to use the building we approved last week as an example, but to say there was a very similar project, could we have asked that owner, we're allowed to exempt a that type of property from its parking requirements?
So they'd have to request a waiver for that. You wouldn't just be able to unilaterally, as a board, give that exemption without them requesting it.
So could we have asked a similar property owner, do you really plan on parking on your front lawn, or are you just doing that for the requirement?
Well, so no one is allowed to park on their front lawn, just to be clear. Tire strips.
That's on the outside of the house and front door.
I don't think that we as staff or you as the board can ask more than the code requirements. So you can say you're required this parking. You can't really ask someone practically if they're going to use it.
Yep.
I mean, I suppose, yeah. You could suggest that to them. They would have to prove that they're eligible for that exemption. So there would have to be a reason that they couldn't provide that parking, which is why I probably wouldn't encourage people to go in that direction.
We've discussed, since I've been on board, we've discussed having a workshop with you all to go over certain code matters. And we haven't had that, so maybe we take this discussion here forward and we have that meeting, because parking is certainly one of them. I've got my piece on it that I'll save for another time, but I do think we should do a joint workshop between this, where we have literally, I think my second meeting I brought it up and we've talked about it ever since. Never had it. So I think it would be a good idea to talk about common issues that you see, common issues we see. Our code has evolved over the years, and there's certain things that we see that should be changed in the code that we make like we're better for all of us. So
I agree, and I think probably most of us.
I agree with it.
We're happy to do whatever workshops or training you all need to make you the best possible board you can be, and your advisory. So we're here for your input.
Okay, one last question on the tax exemption. We approved one last week, the pre-construction, is that the pre-construction just comes to the board, or does it go to the board, then the commission? And then post-construction, does it come back to the board, or does it only go to the commission? Okay.
So the reason we had you all together is because the rest of this presentation or all of the rest of the presentations apply to all of you equally. They're all related to the planning and zoning function that all of you serve for the city as a combined land planning agency.
So hi, my name is Karina Maldonado. I'm the senior community planner. You'll see me at the planning and zoning board meetings. You will not see me at the historic preservation meetings. I have a lot to talk about today, so I will dive in. Wanted to start off with the basics, the history of zoning. The cases listed here, they led the current regulatory framework for the city and the state of Florida. So this slide highlights the beginning and evolution of modern zoning regulation, focusing on key legal and legislative milestones. It starts with, or starts in 1926, the U.S. Supreme Court case, Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty, which is pivotal because it upheld zoning as a constitutional exercise of police power. This ruling confirmed that local governments can regulate land use to protect public health, safety, and welfare. So following this, in 1939, Florida passed the legislation allowing local governments to enact zoning codes, marking an important early step in formal land use regulation. In the 1970s and 80s, there are several significant planning and environmental legislative acts that were passed to strengthen the land use control. Specifically in 1985, the Florida Local Government Comprehensive Planning and Land Development Act was enacted and required local governments to amend their comprehensive plans to ensure consistency with state and regional plans. This also requires local plans to be certified by the Florida Department of Community Affairs, or DCA, which is also responsible for issuing rules defining the minimum criteria for plan approval, and also mandated the local governments adopt the necessary implementing ordinances like land development regulations. So here is a slide of different regulatory documents. We start off with the comprehensive plan. This document is required by Chapter 163 of the Florida Statutes. Amendments to this document are reviewed by the state of Florida. It provides a vision for the community, including the land development, service provisions, and community character-related concerns. Within that, we have the land development regulations. You'll often hear us call it the LDRs. Amendments to the document are also required to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. It includes more detailed regulatory requirements specifically related to land development, which addresses things like setbacks and massing, height, lot coverage, parking, and landscaping. We also have the major thoroughfare design guidelines that Ann discussed. It is a regulatory document adopted by reference with the site and building design requirements for the city's major thoroughfares. It includes a set of design parameters and recommendations for development within a district or areas of specific interest. It also helps developers and designers understand how to implement principle without restricting their creativity and design. So you'll hear a lot about the comprehensive plan and future land use, map and policies. Let's see. It was created by legislative action and is required to be consistent with state and regional plans again. Once it is adopted, it is binding on all development orders, permit approvals, Staff or boards or commission cannot approve any development order or permit that conflicts with the comprehensive plan. Staff, boards, and commission cannot approve variances from the comprehensive plan. So I mentioned the land development regulations. Here's our city website. You'll see, if you're not familiar with it, I'll go through the website a bit. But we have different zoning districts in the city. Each have various specific regulations that is designed to be consistent with the future land use designation for that property. It includes permitted uses or what type of businesses are allowed there. It goes over setbacks or distances from property lines, height for structures, massing of structures and buildings, impermeable surface for buildings, which we refer to as building lot coverage. You'll hear impermeable for all impermeable surfaces, which includes basically the overall lot coverage. That includes buildings and anything that covers a lot like concrete. Other items in the LDRs include, there's many other items, but it does include parking, landscaping, and subdivision requirements. So here's our website. We live on our website every day. We use it for everything. If you ever visit the city website, no matter where you're at the very top, you go to departments. You can click planning and zoning, and it will take you to our page. Has important information like our planner on call schedule. We have our application and forms. We have our maps. This includes the zoning maps, historic maps. And it also includes the regulation plans. If you haven't seen a zoning map, this is what it looks like. The zoning map depicts the entire city limits of Lake Worth Beach. You will not be able to see the zoning for other properties in the county that are not in the city limits of Lake Worth Beach. You can zoom into it. You can type in a specific address. You can scroll around. You click a parcel. It will bring you up. It'll bring up a detail of that property. It'll have the PCN. It'll identify the zoning district, the future land use. There's a lot of good information, and I use this every day, so it's pretty useful. So let's see here. So we have different types of applications. I'll go over the process in a moment, but as a board level, there's specific board level applications or projects that are reviewed for consistency with the adopted regulatory documents, including the land development regulations and the comprehensive plan. If an application is approved, then staff issues a development order. Development orders is an order either granting, denying, or granting with conditions of approval on an application for a development permit. We provide applicants with a letter with their final development order. A development permit includes any building permit, zoning permit, rezoning, subdivision approval, special exception, variance, or any other official action of local government having the effect of permitting the development of land. I wanted to show you the application process for board level applications. To go over it, all board level applications, we require a pre-application meeting with staff. We like to go over with applicants before they even apply for anything. We like to go over what this process will look like. If they have any conceptuals or any type of plan they want us to look at, we'll provide guidance. So after application or applicant submits, we send them an invoice and they come in and pay. Staff reviews their documents for sufficiency. We'll send an applicant a formal letter confirming if we have everything to begin the review or if we need additional information to begin. Oh, too soon. Once the application is deemed complete by staff, we route the project to the site plan review team. We call them the SPRT. That team consists of various reviewers and includes planning and zoning, fire, the Lake Worth Drainage District, the CRA, Public Works, building, utilities, electric, and water, and urban design reviewers. So that's a time for the city to look at a project and determine if there are additional comments or additional items that the project needs to address. We typically take about 2 weeks to review this and gather all of the comments, but we do provide an SPRT letter through email with comments to address. The applicant resubmits and we route the project for review again, or we schedule them for a board hearing whenever there aren't any comments that need to be addressed. Once we schedule the project for a board hearing, we begin the required advertising. We have to post a legal ad, courtesy notices are sent out, and they have to post a sign at the property, advising on the public that they will be attending one of your board meetings. The board then reviews to either deny, approve with conditions, or recommend approval or denial to City Commission, or require continuance to request additional information to hear at another board meeting. So, Anne went over this a bit. It's the same for the PZB board members. As you guys are the advisory, where you're not the final decision makers, but you advise to City Commission to provide recommendation that it is consistent with the comprehensive plan or the LDRs. Those application types include the plan developments, the sustainable bonus incentives, transfer development right incentives, rezoning, comprehensive plan amendments, and right-of-way abandonments. But you are the decision or the final decision maker on variances from the land development regulations, developments of significant impacts, major site plans, and conditional use permits. I can say we probably get many conditional use permits. It's probably the most common application. And then second, the major site plans. And your job is to review for consistency with the city's comprehensive plan and LDRs, including the setbacks, the floor area ratio, building coverage, impermeable surface coverage, just all of the land development regulations. So Anne also went over this of who you are. You are citizens of the community. I'll skip through this. We'll go over meeting procedures. This is just a general procedure list. Staff prepares a staff report. We typically provide that to you within a week or a week prior to the board meeting. The chair opens the meeting and follows the agenda. We'll give you an agenda. We do roll call for attendance. We do the Pledge of Allegiance. We'll go over any additions, deletions, reorderings, and approval of the agenda. We'll approve meetings from the previous meeting. We swear in any staff and applicants or staff and applicants that will have something to talk about at the meeting. Regarding public hearings, we go over any board disclosures, any quasi-judicial procedures, motions, and then public comment. So this is what a staff report looks like. This is what we give you. Staff does an analysis of the project. This is what we provide you. The purpose of the staff report is to provide the board with information to factually describe the project and the applicant's requests, to objectively describe why the application is before the board or the commission, to anticipate and answer questions likely to be asked at the hearing, to provide a professional recommendation, to inform officials and stakeholders on the issues of compliance, consistency, and compatibility with adopted plans and applicable regulations, and to build a public record and legally defensible foundation should litigation arise. A staff report consists of approval or approval with conditions or denial recommendation from staff. Regarding board disclosures, the chair calls for board disclosures, ethic disclosures, voting conflicts of interest. This is required by the state and by the county. We go over quasi-judicial disclosures, ex parte communications. This is also state requirements and city requirement. So now we get to talk about ethics and conflicts. So public officials, again, everyone should have watched an ethics video. We are all required to watch this. But I do want to mention public officials shall not use the public office or position to take or fail to take any action or influence others to take or fail to any action or attempt to do these things in a manner which he or she knows or should know with the exercise of reasonable care with result in a special financial benefit not shared with similar situated members of the public or the listed persons or entities. Public officials shall declare voting conflicts of interest, abstain from voting or participating in disclosing on such matters, and file Form 8B. So, conflicting relationships. There's a long list. Yourself, if you are involved with a project, you cannot vote on it. If your spouse, your partner, typically most family members, your spouse's family members, cannot vote on it. If it is for your employer, someone you do business with, or a civic group that you are a designated officer or director, cannot vote on it.
When you say someone you do business with, we've had conversations about this before. I do development, I work with a lot of planners. We have a planner that has represented me on another project, is representing them. I've been told that's not a conflict. But I do business with them, so can you clarify what exactly you mean by that?
So it's listed here. This is Palm Beach County standards for ethics are a little bit more stringent than the state's standards. And this is from the Palm Beach County code. And so it's if you have an outside employer, if you have a customer or client, and or a substantial debtor or creditor. So those things, what this county looks at is if you have earned money from that person, not if you have paid them money. And it has to be within a certain time period and a certain dollar value. So if you have questions specifically as to a business relationship, feel free to call me ahead of the meeting if you know that it's coming up, or as soon as you recognize that there may be a potential conflict, and we can talk about the details of it. Because every conflict for ethics purposes is very fact specific. So the sooner we can look into it, the sooner we can get you the best answer.
Quasi-judicial proceedings, where you are the final decision maker. It's used when local government applies specific rules to a particular situation. It's subject to certain procedure and substantive thresholds that involve due process, standards of review, and evidentiary considerations. Decisions must be based on a correct application of the law and competent, substantial evidence on the record. Competent, substantial evidence is evidence that has a substantial basis in fact from which the fact at issue can be reasonably inferred. When incompetent, substantial evidence has been presented that compliance has been met, denial must accomplish a legitimate public purpose and not be arbitrary, discriminatory, or unreasonable. Okay. Okay, so quasi-judicial procedures, these code requirements are located in section 23.2-16 of the city's land development regulations. All board members must disclose if they have or reasonably believe to have a demonstrated bias or prejudice for or against any party in the hearing, a direct or indirect monetary interest in the outcome of the hearing, including any campaign contributions, a prejudgment of the issues prior to hearing the facts on the record, or any ex parte communications or personal investigations, including conversations with city staff. If the answer to any of these is yes, the board member must also state whether, based on their response, they are still able to serve as an impartial hearing officer and make a decision based upon the facts on the record. So ex parte communications, it's applicable to quasi-judicial proceedings. It's a discussion with written communications to an investigation and site visits by a local public official on the merits of any matter, which action may be taken by a board or commission on which the official is a member. It applies to both the Historic Resource Preservation Board and Planning and Zoning Board. It presumed to be prejudicial. City Commission has adopted Section 23.2-16H regarding ex parte communications and establishing procedures for disclosure that removes the presumption of prejudice. If the substance of an ex parte communication is disclosed, including a subject of communication and identity of whom the communication was with, any written communication is made part of the record. Any site visit, personal investigation, or expert opinion received must be disclosed and made part of the record. So back to meeting procedures, we'll go over motions. Any board member other than the chair may make a motion. The chair may pass the gavel to the vice chair and is then able to make a motion. The chair must recognize the motion and the motion maker and ask for a second. Any board member may second a motion. If this is done prior to the chair recognizing the motion and maker, the chair may recognize the motion and second and their makers at the same time. The chair must recognize the second and second maker and may ask for additional board discussion, public comment, and or call for the vote. Votes should be verbal and called for as all in favor. After receiving a response, called for all opposed. Chair must announce the result of the motion and the tally of the vote for and against. So votes should be verbal and called for as in all in favor and or receiving a response called for all opposed. The chair must announce the result of the motion and the tally of the vote for and against. Votes pass on a vote of majority of the quorum. We need 4 members to meet quorum. Sometimes you will get an email before the meeting asking if you will attend, so we can ensure that there will be quorum. If we know we will not have at least 4 people at the meeting, then we'll cancel or reschedule the meeting. So it's important to check your emails to see if we need to do that. So an affirmative vote of at least 3 members required for historic designations, variances, waivers, demolitions, and planned developments. Public comment. You'll see sometimes we have members come in and we'll go over public comment regarding agenda items. If we have a project on the agenda, the chair will ask if there's any public comment on if any public member has comment for a specific project on the agenda before the board takes a vote. For non-agenda items, prior to the end of the meeting, the chair will ask the public comment on any non-agenda items. The rules for public comment are limited to 3 minutes per person per item. Non-agenda items are considered a single item. They must be related to the item or non-agenda item related to historic preservation and no responses or planning and zoning. And no response is necessary. Sunshine law. So staff has a responsibility for meeting notices, locations, and minutes. We are required to provide this information. that a public meeting will be happening. Board members' responsibilities for communication. There are prohibitions on the discussion between two or more members of the same board regarding matters that may foreseeably come to before that board. We want to know what that discussion is. Does it matter? Where and how the discussion takes place. Communications limitations do not apply to staff unless staff made part of a decision-making process or staff used as a go-between to relay information between board members. So you can't ask me, a board member cannot ask me to talk to another board member about the project. Public record laws, any document made or received in the transaction of official business is public record. So everything I do at work is basically public record. If somebody wants public record, they can formally request through the city manager's office or the city clerk. And we have to provide that. More ethics. So public officials shall not use, yes.
Let me just chime in here. I know you all have done all of your legal training, but this is just as it applies to you as an advisory board member and decision maker here in the city of Lake Worth Beach, just to make sure that we are all on the same page, that what you do for your board here with the city, the records that you receive are public records related to this position. So it's not just your agenda packets that you get in the mail. If you have a neighbor that says, hey, I know you're on that board, I have this issue. Their communication with you related to your position on this board is a public record. If you receive or have communications like that over text or email or social media, make sure that you are sending a copy of that to staff so they can retain that public record and you don't have to. That's the most important part. Okay? If it's verbal, there's no public record. Only if it would be related to a project that comes before you, and then you would make that as part of your ex parte disclosure.
All right, we're almost done here. More ethics. Public officials shall not use or attempt to use the public office or position or any property or resource which may be within his or her trust to corruptly secure or attempt to secure special privilege, benefit, or exemption for the public official or others. Should not enter into any contract or other transaction for goods or services with the town that includes the public official's outside employer or business and any person, agency, or entity acting for the town.
I'm going to cut in again. So on this, if you would like to do business with the city as a sitting advisory board, there are steps that you have to go to if you want to bid on work for the city or if you want to have a contract with the city in some manner. Because of your position, sometimes it is possible. So get in touch with me before you take that kind of action. If that's something that you're interested in doing and the work that you do is facilitated, allows for that. And we can walk through whether we can get you there or not. But before you take the step, give me a call so we can make sure you can get there. Let's talk about whether there are exemptions for emergency services under the statute, because the statute, Florida law prohibits people from doing business with their own agency. And as board members, you all are considered part of the agency of the city of Lake Worth Beach. So you are not allowed to do business with the city of Lake Worth Beach. There are certain exemptions if you go through certain bidding processes, and there may be one for emergency services. So let's talk and see if so that you have the answer before you need the answer.
And briefly, public officials shall not also accept gifts, keep or solicit any accepted gifts directly or indirectly in any gift of value greater than $100. Public officials shall report gifts in excess of $100.
Is that a legal thing? Laws that have to conflict with each other?
No, so there are certain vendors and lobbyists and things that you aren't allowed to accept any gifts from. But there are people who, if you do receive a gift and it's not from a prohibited person, if it's more than $100, you have to report it.
Family member gives you a gift of $100, should we vote that?
Friends and family are exempt from that rule.
A campaign contribution? Like, obviously wouldn't affect us, like, you know, the commissioners.
Campaign contributions, I don't remember under the state laws whether they have to be reported or not, but the city has laws on campaign contributions where they have to disclose those, especially if they're related to a project.
They're all reported. Every month. We all record.
But I don't know if it's through the state ethics laws or through the election laws.
Are you through the ethics thing
Basically, I just have the links here for the state ethics training and the county's ethics training. That completes my presentation. Elizabeth will be going over variance training.
Yeah.
It's not. I just used stock photos that are available in PowerPoint, and I did not find my own very fancy Lake Worth Beach pictures. So that's what we got. So I'm going to try and get through this pretty quick for you guys. Variances apply to all of you. You all have here on occasion applications for variances, and you work through these. So it became apparent at some point in the last couple of years that we needed to make sure that you all as board members understand the purpose of variances and how these work. So as you all have heard tonight, what you all do from a planning perspective, you're looking at the city charter is the primary guide constitution for the city and how it operates. Then from a land planning perspective, there's the comprehensive plan, which is the next level of control, then the land development regulations. And then, of course, there's always case law that applies statewide and sometimes nationally on land development related issues. So when you're looking at a development that comes forward, compliance with all of these documents is required. That's the basic for any development. You have to comply with all these regulatory documents. Variances are provided as a relief when compliance with all those documents is unobtainable. You cannot give variances from the charter or from the comprehensive plan, only from the land development regulations. The city has these provisions in its land development regulations that set out the framework for how you all are able to consider variances. Variances are authorized only for height, area and size of a structure, size of yards, parking requirements, and other area requirements in open spaces. The establishment or expansion of a use or density otherwise prohibited or not permitted cannot be allowed by variance. Variances cannot be granted that are inconsistent with the city charter, as we already said. You may only grant, your boards are the appropriate granting bodies for variances. That is not a staff function. And the power to grant variances is limited by and contingent upon documentation that all required findings are made. And then here are the list of required findings that are also set out in the code. There have to be special circumstances or conditions that exist, which are peculiar to the land or building for which the variance is sought and do not apply generally to nearby lands and buildings, and that this is not the result of the action of the applicant. And I think a lot of you who have been on the boards for a while know that that's probably the phrase that disqualifies most variances that come before us that get denied, is that the reason for the variance was caused by the applicant. And so you can't grant the variance because of that requirement. The strict application of the provisions of the land development regulations would deprive the applicant of any reasonable use of the land or building for which the variance is sought. The variance proposed is the minimum variance, which makes the reasonable use of the land or building possible. And that the granting of the variance will be in accordance with the spirit and purpose of the land development regulations and will not be unduly injurious to contiguous property or the surrounding neighborhood or otherwise detrimental to the public welfare. So when you're reviewing a variance, you have to check each and every one of those criteria. It meets this, it meets this, it meets this, it meets this. If they're missing any of those, the variance cannot be granted. Yes.
Result of action by the applicant is somebody builds a 20-foot fence. Now they're coming to ask for a variance because they built that 20-foot fence. Is that an example?
That is an example. If your fence height is if the land development regulations say your fence height is 6 feet and it cannot be higher than 6 feet, and you build a 20-foot fence and you say, but I have to have this 20-foot fence, but they built it. I need it because of my land. My land is different. But if they created the issue, they cannot get the variance for it. So there is a lot of case law going back a long time and all the way up till, I found cases from 2025 that were still coming out about new ways that variances are being enforced or denied. And so, but a lot of this is really, you're creating relief for legitimate, unnecessary hardship. And this, again, a lot of the case law goes back to, but the applicant created the problem. So the applicant isn't bringing forward a legitimate claim for unnecessary hardship because they created it themselves. So some takeaways from the cases. Enforcement of legitimate zoning regulations is in the public interest. That is your primary goal, is to make sure that they comply with the land development regulations as they're stated. Variances relieve unique hardship that would otherwise make a zoning ordinance arbitrary, oppressive, or confiscatory as to a particular property, rendering it void and unconstitutional in its application to that property. Confiscatory? It means you're confiscating it. Yeah. Prerequisites to granting a variance are a presence of exceptional and unique hardship, hardship that cannot be self-created, and hardship that cannot be one of mere economic disadvantage. So it can't be something that is really just, but it would cost me more to do it the way the land development regulations want me to do it. That's not sufficient. Agreement of your neighbors saying, oh, all my neighbors think that what I'm trying to do is okay, is not sufficient to granting a variance. The unique hardship must not be applicable to others in the same zoning classification. That's how unique it is. Hardships that are found where the property is virtually unusable or incapable of yielding a reasonable return when used pursuant to applicable zoning regulations. So again, this is really unique where when you try and apply that zoning regulation, it makes that property completely unusable. Self-created hardship includes building different than approved plans, failure to obtain a permit, overbuild of the lot, making the compliance with the land development regulations impossible. All those things are not grounds for a variance. Deprivation of rights commonly enjoyed by others in the same zoning classification is not found when the hardship is economic or a reduction in the desired outcome. For example, your pool can't be as large as you want it, or your screen enclosure, or the development of the lot. You can't fill as much of it. You can't make your house as big as you want to. Those things are not considered to be a hardship sufficient for a variance. So as Karina went over, variances have to be based on competent substantial evidence. They are in that quasi-judicial category of decision-making. There is procedural due process that must be followed, and a prior grant of a variance to someone else on a similar issue is not appropriate consideration for granting a variance to someone else. So yes, if you grant a variance to someone, if someone else comes up for a variance with a similar circumstance, you say, oh, can't say, well, we gave it to somebody else under a similar circumstance. That's not competent substantial evidence to grant a variance. Even though a lot of the factors are the same, you have to go through the analysis all over again. Substantial evidence is more than just a scintilla. It's relevant evidence that a reasonable mind might accept to support a conclusion. And although substantial evidence standard is not stringent or as stringent as preponderance of the evidence standard that the courts have to use on other decisions, it does require a harder look than reviewing under the arbitrary and capricious. So the lowest standard of review is this decision reasonable or is it arbitrary and capricious? That's a very broad standard. A little more narrow is the competent substantial evidence, which is what applies here. And then even more stringent is the preponderance of the evidence standard. So we're kind of in that middle ground with the level of review that you have to do for these types of applications. To determine whether a state or local government meets the substantial evidence standard, the court must look at the entirety of the record, but cannot displace the locality's fair estimate of conflicting evidence and cannot freely reweigh the evidence. That's really important for you all to know, that as local government body, when you are making these decisions, if it is appealed to the court, they're relying on how you weigh the evidence, what's important in your community, how do you all see this? They're not going to reweigh that evidence, but it's important to make sure that the evidence is on the record for them to see, which is why the staff report provides so much documentation of how each application meets or does not meet the criteria for review. And if you disagree with the staff report, that we make sure that you all put different evidence on the record that the application meets or does not meet this criteria for review. That's really important to make sure those criteria and analysis get on the record. The courts have found that aesthetic objections coupled with evidence of an adverse impact on property values or safety concerns can constitute substantial evidence. This was related to, it is fairly local. There are a couple of different cases here, and it was related a lot to residential communities and cell tower locations. The court also credits testimony from residents. Here again is a similar kind of thing with towers, where an antenna would in fact decrease property values, especially in light of the highly residential, under-industrialized nature of the town of Palm Beach Shores. So when a request includes an application of regulations to a specific property, the procedure is quasi-judicial. Karina went over a lot of things about quasi-judicial procedures with you already, so I'm going to kind of skip through this fairly quickly. Quasi-judicial proceedings do require due process, so that's notice and an opportunity to be heard. So that's why all of your quasi-judicial proceedings, you'll see in your agenda packet that there's been notice provided, there's a publication, and there's always the ability for the applicant, and sometimes if we have an affected party, for them to come up and give testimony and ask questions. The decision must be based on competent, substantial evidence that is on the record of the hearing. And of course, beware of the ex parte communications that Karina went into in pretty good depth. Again, competent, substantial evidence is evidence that has a substantial basis in fact, from which the fact at issue can be reasonably inferred. The staff analysis in your staff report, that is the purpose of that. And the courts have found that the staff analysis can be the basis of your competent, substantial evidence for making your decision, which is another reason, again, if you disagree with staff's interpretation, that we put additional evidence on the record that supports the decision that you want to make and how you see it differently. When competent, substantial evidence has been presented and that the compliance has been met, denial must accomplish a legitimate public purpose and must not be arbitrary, discriminatory, or unreasonable. And the rest of this Karina went over already, so I won't double dip, but ex parte communications are covered under the code. They are considered under state law to be prejudicial, but the city has adopted provisions that allow the removal of the prejudice if you follow these steps. And that's it. Do you all have any questions about variances and quasi-judicial proceedings? Yeah. Absolutely. So if the staff report says we don't think the application meets this criteria, we recommend denial, your reversal is to put the competent, substantial evidence on the record that the criteria have been met and that you want to approve the application.
Like right before this,
Mhm.
the first on the right hand side, maybe it's one more report where it said the aesthetics, aesthetic objections coupled with evidence of adverse impact can constitute. So we have had applications come before us before where those really are, and essentially they're not caused by the applicant. There's been, in a lot of cases, been a zoning change where what they have currently is now no longer allowed, and they're going to repair that. And then they get hit with, no, actually, you've got to move your fence because the code doesn't allow it there anymore. We had one where there were mature trees behind it, and to move it back, but they either had to cut down the trees or they could, in their backyard, going into the backyard, they can only have a 4-foot high fence. Those are we can consider, because the standard is saying that it doesn't need a reasonable use versus saying that aesthetic objections coupled with, those are pretty different. They're pretty far apart in terms of one saying you need this evidence and this saying that this type of evidence can constitute. Can you in any way clarify that for me?
Not at the moment, but I will go back and review those and I'll bring that back to you all. Yep.
Wouldn't you want to consider that?
staff report requires you to have their own evidence?
The staff report goes through the criteria and provides an analysis for each of the criteria and staff's opinion on whether or not that criteria has been met and why, really. And so that the courts have found that because the staff report usually contains all that kind of information, that can be considered competent substantial evidence, because that is the type of information that you would be putting on the record with looking at a criteria, providing information as to why you thought the project met or did not meet the criteria, and then moving on to the next criteria and deciding. And so all that information that you would have to put on the record as you went through the project, staff has done for you already. And so the courts have said, if you have that and you agree with that and you want to rely on that, that's sufficient. But if you disagree with it on any points, you need to make sure that you're counterbalancing that with different evidence on the record.
There's about it.
That determination on how we move forward, and then provides guidance to staff on whether or not we move on that.
If you all have specific things that you would like to discuss, whether it be topics or specific code provisions, please make sure to get those to staff ahead of time so that they can make sure that everybody else has reviewed them and it can speak to help further the discussion, and instead of saying, well, thanks for your opinions, but I got to go back and read that now. And that way the staff and all the other board members can be prepared. So what Scott was saying is that, as Mr. Walewski asked at the beginning of the meeting, is that we're going to set up a joint workshop with both boards again, so you all can discuss issues that are common to both of you that you would see or have come before you. And both of you want to discuss parking and have mentioned it before. So that is one issue that we know is going to be on the agenda for discussion, but we want to make sure that everybody is aware of the things that board members want to talk about so that everyone can be prepared to have a thorough discussion on it.
Vice Chair, I think we'll vote on it in the next meeting.
Yeah.
You don't have a vice chair right now, no vice chair of that.
But yeah, you'll have to-
Well, that's some point.
Yeah, and it wasn't included in the presentations, but just so the new people know, both boards collectively constitute the land planning agency. So any comprehensive plan amendments and any changes to the land development regulations have to come before both boards for a recommendation. Even if it's not historic, it still has to come to the historic board. Correct. Yes.
That same various presentation are very similar to it.
Yeah, everyone has done all the existing board members, I think, have done all of these presentations before. But we would like to at least have them, reviewed on an annual basis, keep everybody up to speed with their knowledge and but we will reorder and consolidate to the best we can now that,
And we do appreciate.
Yeah, we're constantly through session monitoring potential legislation, and then as it is officially signed and adopted by the governor, or you hit that magic deadline where everything that hasn't been signed is officially signed, we do monitor that really closely. We try and make sure that staff and elected officials are updated of what's coming and how it impacts them. And then as we proceed, drafting new regulations and reviewing projects, we do try and make sure we're keeping all those new things in mind too, because we have caught ourselves a couple times where we're working along on something and we go, oh, wait, we can't do this anymore and take that back out. So it can be a lot to keep up with, but it's a, yeah.
Around July, you'll all receive from the election supervisor a financial disclosure. They're going to ask you all. Some of you have already done this. Some of you, the newer board members, will have to do that. I just want to remind you that they're going to ask you for these financial disclosures, and you're going to want to complete them and send them back to whomever I think the email or whatever is on there that you'll want to return those. That happens every year, so it's not unusual. It sometimes comes as a surprise, and you're like, "What?" But they, again, because it's Palm Beach County, they're a little bit more stringent with that. And so that will be coming, as well as the elections for the boards. Usually we do that in January. Didn't happen this year. So it's going to be probably in February. Next meeting, we'll probably have an election. So if you can think of who and how you want to rearrange yourselves, that would be great. So it doesn't come as a surprise at the meeting.